Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephen Matisio. I'm the Director and Chief Curator of the Blaffer Art Museum at the University of Houston, and I'm so pleased to be welcoming you to tonight's panel discussion titled Visuality. And I want to start off by thanking my colleagues and collaborators at Asia Society Texas and the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft. All of us are co-presenting this evening's discussion, and we have been so pleased to work with one another. And I also want to thank Scott and Judy Nyquist for their sponsorship of this public program. This discussion was originally convened around the Blaffer's presentation of Stephanie Syjuco's solo exhibition, The Visible Invisible, which I very much encourage you to visit. It will be closing this Sunday, January 10th. But we will continue a number of the installations through the spring, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end of this discussion. But I also want to acknowledge that all of us have been shaken by the events that are taking place in Washington, D.C. today. But artists throughout history have shed insight into history and have allowed us moments of reflection and introspection. And we are so pleased and honored to be convening this discussion with four special artists tonight. And so I'm going to give a very brief introduction to our moderator for the evening, Matt Manalo, who will then introduce his fellow artists and panelists. So Matt is an artist, an art worker, and the founder of the Filipinx Artists of Houston, a collective of visual, performing, literary, culinary, and multidisciplinary artists. He also runs an alternative art space and collaborative hub, the A-Leaf Art House, which was established in 2019. And I'm also very pleased to say that Matt will be part of a group exhibition opening at the Blaffer Museum on January 27th, titled Carriers, the Body as a Site of Danger and Desire. Matt, I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Matt Manalo, and I am your moderator tonight. Before anything else, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land we are on. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations that can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We acknowledge that the land we are meeting on today has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of indigenous peoples, specifically the Sana and Coahuiltecan nations. Additionally, Texas is home to the Alabama Coushatta tribe of Texas, the Kickapoo traditional tribe of Texas, the Isleta del Sur Pueblo, the Lipan Apache tribe, and the Texas Band of Yaqui Indians. In Oakland, California, the Ohlone tribe, and in Connecticut, Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scaticoke, Golden Hill, Pagauset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, and other Algonquian speaking peoples. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brings us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths as at any and all public events. Thank you. Let me begin again by introducing myself. Thank you for that brief introduction earlier, Stephen. My name is Matt Manalo, if you're just joining us today. I'm an artist and organizer, and I was born in Manila, Philippines, and has called Houston, Texas home since 2004. I create works with elements of painting, sculpture, photography, and printmaking, which discusses experiences navigating around physical and social structures while exploring erasure, colorism, and colonial mentality. Next, please join me in giving our panelists a warm welcome as I introduce them and their work. Born in the Philippines and residing in Houston, multi-city muralist and painter Royal Sumikat, she, her, is a dynamic human and a futurist artist. She works with spray paint, gouache, acrylic paints, markers, and most recently, the app Procreate. While the images in her works appear to contradict each other, this is intentional, highly contrasting colors, textures, and ideas. Sumikat's work is informed by her experiences as an immigrant, community organizer, and priestess, taking inspiration from the spaces afforded by these different identities. Storytelling and mythology are prevalent in her work as she aims to strengthen the connection she has with her ancestors. The next artist, we have Antonius-Tin, they, them, is a spontaneous shapeshifter and polydisciplinary artist with roots all over the United States. They proudly identify as a queer, non-binary Vietnamese American Slasian. Born and raised in Bronx, New York, Bowie moved to Houston before pursuing a BFA at the Maryland Institute College of Art. Since graduating in 2016, Bowie has garnered fellowships from the Vermont Studio Center, Kala Art Institute, Tulsa Artists Fellowship, Halcyon Arts Lab, Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, Yaddo, Anderson Center at Tower View, the Growlery and Fine Arts Work Center. Bowie has exhibited at various institutional, private, public, and underground venues, including the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, IANA at Hillier, Lawndale Arts Center, Pennsylvania College of Art and Design, Artscape, Satellite Art Fair Austin, Blaffer Art Museum, La Bande Art Gallery, and the Smithsonian Arts and Industries Building. And last but not the least, we have Stephanie Syjuco, she, her, works in photography, sculpture, and installation, moving from handmade and craft-inspired mediums to digital editing and archive excavations. Her recent work has focused on how photography and image-based processes are implicated in the construction of racialized, exclusionary narratives of history and citizenship. Currently, The Visible Invisible is on display at Blaffer Art Museum through January 10. Syjuco has exhibited her work widely, nationally, and internationally, including at the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis, the MoMA PS1, the Whitney Museum of American Art, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the 12th Havana Biennial, the 2015 Asian Art Biennial in Taiwan, among others. Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., and is the recipient of numerous accolades, including a 2014 Guggenheim Fellowship Award, a 2009 Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculptors Award. Okay, welcome again to Visuality, an artist roundtable. This event is organized by Blaffer Art Museum, Asia Society of Texas, and the Houston Center of Contemporary Craft. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you are staying warm and dry this evening. We are honored to have you here. If you have any questions for our artists, please feel free to type them in the comments. So now let's head into discussions. I guess it's just proper to just ask everyone, how is everyone doing?
It's been a day. My eyes have been plastered on Twitter and the internet. Yeah, it's been a day.
Another day in a white supremacist nation.
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah. No, I know it's an intense context, but then earlier I felt reticent actually about moving forward with the talk, but coming to realize too that things shouldn't stop and things shouldn't change just because folks take it upon themselves to change the narrative. And so it's been interesting, and it's made me think a lot about some of the topics that I think we were going to be discussing today.
Okay, well, with that in mind, how has 220 impacted your practice? Has it changed in an indelible way? And what do you foresee in 2021?
Ooh, we jumped right in.
It's been a day and it's been a year.
Yeah, well, it seems like 2021 will be another year, I can answer that first. So 2021 has impacted my practice. I didn't really make a lot of art in 2021, or in a capitalistic sense, I didn't make a lot of art, but I did transform my backyard into a thriving garden. And for me, that is art. It's just not, quantifiable by money. I mean, in my money, I spent a lot of money. But it's also made me look within, and there's that looming question: what can artists do in this time? How do we show? How do we present our work while we can't even be close to each other? Yeah.
I think in the beginning of the pandemic, I think a lot of us were very enamored by the language of creating a new normal, being prophets, and envisioning a future that isn't so compliant to the accelerated capitalism that we live within. And I was hoping that 2021 would be very different, but it feels like every single institution and space is like demanding more and more of us, and our resources are so slim, and it really challenges our abilities to be there for ourselves, for our communities, and for our artwork. So I really don't know how I will survive. And I think that's a question that all of us are asking ourselves.
Yeah, I guess to echo some of these sort of pivots, and I hate to use that word, right? Because that's so overused, and it also comes from the tech world. But the possibility of rethinking things, I think, opened up a lot. But at the same time, I think it also put pressures onto maybe reconsidering ways of living that we've actually built up for ourselves. So, I've been thinking about, as an artist with a 25-year professional practice, when things just stopped, it felt like this beautiful moment in a horrible context, right? To completely re-envision, but at the same time, it's a little, I worry and wonder about what is going to be left behind in the reshuffle. Right. So now that, there's been a bit of a pause for those of us that can afford to pause. Mm-hmm. And again, I'll throw that back out. But, 2020 for me was less about art production and more about thinking about how I want to plan better for the future.
Yeah. Looks like, everyone, when we started the 2020, we were like, oh, this is going to be great. This is all about 2020 vision. And in some way, it's sort of like, this is kind of like the vision that we sort of needed in a way, because now we're thinking about ourselves more, and we're thinking about like what rest means, especially being an artist. And we're also thinking about compensation, with the work that we do. And, being an artist of color, of course, then that's like another level for us. Is there an added pressure or urgency to internally or externally identify, that in our work? Or, can we make is our work political, or does it have to be political, or is it is it separated from being personal? You know, with that thought of how 2020 was with us as an artist and as a POC artist. Yeah, I mean, so how did art basically make its way through our trying to survive, you know, the times?
I'm gonna chip away at this. I just read this amazing conversation between Legacy Russell and American artists, and they were talking a lot about the failures of representation within the art world and how that is just a move towards restorative dignity, when in fact what we're really searching for is restorative justice. And we are still so far away from that because our art institutions, which we are dependent upon oftentimes as art workers, are still rooted in capitalism, in white supremacy. And it seems like we haven't taken the proper time to truly reflect on what structural changes need to be made and how to really get towards a more just and equitable art world.
Yeah. I've been thinking too about, you know, so the demand right now, as Matt was mentioning, for a kind of representation to happen. So now that the institutions sort of, you know, have felt more pressure to be more forthcoming or more, you know, forward looking, I feel like a lot of artists of color are being tapped to, you know, to be present, but to be present in very specific ways. And so I am very wary about that, because I also can see it, you know, similar to what you're mentioning, Antonius, about, you know, this notion of that's supposed to somehow alleviate, you know, or handle all the, you know, the decades, the centuries of, you know, compounded problems. So it's ironic to be suspicious, but again, you know, it's like I feel like I came up of age in the early 90s during, you know, the first sort of wave of what was dubbed identity politics at the time, and that was, you know, I saw it kind of like crash in terms of how, you know, the backlash to it. And so I'm curious about the lasting outcomes of some of the initiatives that appear to be happening right now.
So how do you feel organizations can play a better supporting role in facilitating, you know, work between artists and the public and these specific communities that they're? Is there something that we can suggest to them that they can change to be better, so they can, you know, better support us? Any thoughts on that?
Right.
Okay. So as a person of color, an artist of color, we're always striving to like have a room at the seat at the table. I want to abolish the table altogether. I don't know what the suggestions are, because again, it's like, what are institutions, who has the power in these institutions? And whenever we bring in like what is that, you know, diversity training, it's like it's just bringing in diversity for you know, people of color to participate in the same systems. It's not changing the systems, it's just adding more color to the same system. So I don't know, where do we begin? That's like that always plays in my head. Yeah.
I also think, though, what's interesting is that, I mean, we've all sort of, we're deeply rooted in these systems and these institutions. And we actually, you know, we've collaborated and worked with them constantly. And, you know, and we are also them, you know, just the fact of even being here in this discussion. And so I wonder too about, you know, some of the calls for, you know, total reorganization, how they can be done in ways that, that I guess are, that work, right? Because there have been, like, let's say, elders that have been invested in some of these things that have worked really hard to create pathways. And yeah, we're at a really interesting moment. And, you know, like what Antonius was saying, it's also super early. So, you know, what the lasting outcomes are. And I guess I'm curious, like, you know, with the, you know, with Matt, with the organizations that you've started also, like, how has the Filipinx group, like, is there something that's picking up in terms of its visibility because of the way institutions are framing things now?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for asking the question, but yeah, definitely. You know, well, the whole idea of the group is to be able to band together and make things happen as a group, and also through that we can also have representation within the art world. You know, especially here in Houston. And I know that you have shown in Houston way before at the CAM, Stephanie, and you know, and I'm sure that was also through Sixto. And he was the one who told me about you and how you showed at the CAM before. And I was also thinking, like, how come I've never met these people, or how come I never heard of Stephanie at that time? Or, you know, I mean, of course I wasn't in the US yet, but, you know, there are a lot of things that needed to be organized or put together, especially in this time, especially that Houston has a lot of Filipinos, and we're also kind of like stereotypically known to just work at the medical field, to just kind of like group together and work together, because we have a lot of talent out there that needs to be represented. And you know, in 2020, you know, when we founded each other in 2019, it was great. We were like meeting every month. We're, you know, organizing film screening and poetry readings and book stuff. And 2020 has been really rough for us, but we've also continued on working on different things, right, other than just art. Because me personally, you know, art making was also rough for me. You know, being a parent, I had to be there for virtual classes and stuff like that. And also, you know, try to be an artist at the same time. But, you know, it's really hard to kind of like just be split in different things. But, you know, out of the year as well, there was a lot of like other initiatives that kind of sprouted from starting the Filipinx, and Royal is you know, a good example for that. You know, she had started an initiative. I don't know if you want to talk about it, Royal.
Okay, yeah. So I organized with a group called the Houseless Organizing Coalition. And so it's basically just like it's a mutual aid group that organizes with houseless folks in the Houston area. And then I feel like a lot of that, there's so many ties to experiencing imperialism and colonization, and because of capitalism, like there's so many people that have been left you know, and forgotten. And so it's like so many people are like left to pick up the slack that the government can't pick up. Like, why do we have to do this when there's a rich government that can can support us but choose not to? And I don't know, I think I may have gone off on a tangent, but shout out to HOC. And so that formulated because of a need and because of the rising, you know, everything coming to head last year. And I think a lot of people are finally realizing like, hey, we all need to wake up and all hands on deck. Yeah. I think I went off on a tangent.
No, you're fine. You know, you're totally fine, because like I was thinking of how us as artists, we're the one who has been working during the pandemic. You know, we've been distributing information, we've been doing mutual aid, we've been, you know, creating work, and that's like music, film, paintings, or anything visual. And, you know, and like my question earlier, it's like, this is still work. And unfortunately, we're also the ones being forgotten or just not given enough credit for all the things that we've done so far. And it just makes me think like that's like art expanding into the community. And so how does your art play that role, or how do you think your art expand through the community, and how what?
No, this was a really good question, so I wrote something out for this.
Okay.
I know it was supposed to be organic, but I'm like, no, I need to articulate these thoughts. So for me, art functions in the expansion of community because art is storytelling, right? I used to feel intimidated to do this because I didn't want to tell a story incorrectly, but I was once told by Christian Toledo that in regards to making art, the more personal it is, the more universal it becomes, right? And that really landed with me. And now it sits in the back of my head every time I create or think about anything artistic, because once I did start telling my own stories, people started coming out of the woodwork to tell their own very similar stories that I thought was just like isolated to my family and immediate community members. As far as so how does art inform? There's numerous connections and parallels that become obvious in communities of color sharing their art. Similar fights against colonization and oppression across the globe, which builds solidarity. And then the people that we organize with, like a lot of them are artists. It's just like, I'm just like so amazed at how many talented people are out there, like, in the pandemic, making art, organizing, and like showing up for the community every week. And it's just so inspiring.
Yeah. Stephanie, you want to talk about the masks that you made?
Oh.
And how, oh my gosh, when I saw you posting about it and then you started making like countless of them. How was that for you?
Well, I guess things shut down, right? So, earlier I was locked out of my studio, so that was sort of the practical reason that I stopped, making studio work, but also because it seemed like there were really more important things to do than make art. I mean, I love this idea that, that artists, like what we do is essential and that it's important and that it's about, culture and community. But at the same time, I actually think there's times where, other things come to the forefront. So whether that's sort of, political protest or being on the streets or, making masks, which is what I wound up doing full time for a couple months. So I converted, my home office into, I made thousands or over 1,000. I can't claim thousands, but quite a lot that I distributed for free to organizations that couldn't ordinarily afford them. So unhoused community groups and, elderly folks. And it was at the time, the shortage was happening. Now it seems like, folks have, there's been enough PPE in that arena. But, it really struck me too about that, the things are so and were so and still are so dire that it really made me question actually all the structures of the art sort of like apparatus that I'd invested in for 25 years. And I'm still grappling with it. And I say that as I have a wonderful, amazing exhibition up right now at the Blaffer Museum. And then I'm working towards a commercial gallery show. But I really am still grappling with, to what end. And thankfully, I feel like I do have a kind of parallel practice, which is both socially engaged and also kind of clandestinely political. Like a lot of the things, some of the things I do, I don't talk about. And so as long as, I'm curious about the intersections of those and also how one field may or may not actually support another field that we do, so Royal, you kind of mentioned that too of, like that being like on the ground was the place that was, really formative, as opposed to, these other spaces that sometimes we inhabit and that we enjoy inhabiting too, right? Like I do appreciate, the sort of formal aspects of the art world and what it offers. But yeah, Antonius, I'm curious too about, how you balance those things, or what seems to come to the forefront right now.
Yeah, no, that is a very important thing. Based off of what you said, I'm really thinking a lot about, I don't want to use the word fetishization, but the recent trend to really exhibit community-based work, socially engaged work, political art, and how, there's a lot of capital in that right now. And how I'm thinking a lot about what you said, Royal, in terms of homelessness, value, how do we assign value to people, and how institutions want to support communities, but oftentimes they don't even like humanize or individualize them. They view them as labor or work, as a commodity. And I think that's how, politically engaged work is becoming co-opted in many ways. And there's less of a separation between the worlds of art that you brought up, Stephanie.
Antonius, you and I have both experienced this, personally with our work, with installations and,
Yeah.
You want to talk about the struggle that we faced regarding providing, it's all out right now. You want to talk about we can talk about the struggle that we faced with helping other folks.
Yeah, I guess it applies to not just like installations, but a lot of grants in general, in terms of when you receive funding, the demand to really itemize every single little thing, and where you're allowed to redistribute funds, and how commissioning another artist or bringing in community members sometimes isn't considered a valid use of funds, when in fact that is essential to the work that you do, or that is how you define art itself. And so it's like, what forms of work are validated and acknowledged within the art world? I think that's like the broader question in terms of, grant making and grant funding.
Yeah. I mean, because we also, I think institutions need to understand also that tapping up that grant or that proposal is still work. And a lot of artists also have to dealing with it if their proposal doesn't get accepted, and how feedback is very important. And I'm glad that some institutions that I've worked with have provided that to the artists who have applied and got denied and all that. But it's still pretty, looking at the whole general art world, it's still kind of like you just get a no and that's it. Like, how are you going to grow as an artist from that, right? Since we were talking about, communities, what does local mean? And now that the pandemic happened and everything is virtual, does that change the way you work or the language that you've used with your work? I know Royal has started kind of like shifting her personal work with the pandemic. And I'm interested in knowing.
Did you say what is local? Like, what do we define as local?
So is it still local? If our work expands through a different sphere?
Oh, wow, that's very like meta. That's a good question, you know what I mean? Because prior to the pandemic, like as an artist, people know me as a muralist, but now I'm creating my first installation, and a lot of it, like, I feel like was driven by last year and unpacking a lot of my immigrant experiences and how like stuff is still kind of the same but different, you know what I mean? Like and so now local, it's not local anymore because people online see my art. Like there were performances or like online Zoom art shows that I participated in. So like, where is my art? Like it's in it's in the ether, and people from different states were able to view it in the pandemic alone. Like that was the first time that's ever happened.
Yeah, I kind of wonder about, so, we're using this term art, which is interesting. And then we're sort of imagining, what that is or what it could be. And I've actually stopped kind of using the word art. I say projects now.
Okay.
Really, like what it did, it freed up everything. It was just like, oh, somehow like I was defining if I defined it as art, then I felt it had to kind of occupy a certain type of like public perception or aesthetic space or, formality of like that, those three letters. But then now it's just projects, and it's so freeing, You could do projects, in a gallery, you could do projects out in the world, you could do, invisible projects, whatever. But I guess like back to your question too about community, I guess I've thought a lot too about, so I'm based in Oakland, which is sort of more, I guess, has been more at the forefront recently, but has traditionally been sort of like, the smaller city to San Francisco. But Oakland, has such a vibrant culture. And so that's made me think a lot harder too about how Oakland has been represented and is representing itself in popular culture, in recent years. But also from our kind of global reaches, like we all appear to be sort of from the diaspora or, really relating to the immigrant experience. And I've been thinking a lot about how also our work is so American. It's really American, and if you were to look at other artists that, we have similar, say, ethnic heritages from who are working overseas or, in the countries from which we hail, the concerns are like totally different. And so there's this fascinating kind of like, crossing between, say, our hyper local and then also what we perceive as our global. At least on my end.
No, that's
interesting.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
I was gonna say that like I noticed this last year with the protests happening in the Philippines that there was a lot of like political art, and I mean they were burning effigies in public, and I'm just like, wow, that's like really powerful. You can't even burn an effigy in the street here without getting like the fire marshal called on you. So it is. Can you expand on what you mean by American? Is it like a little more like muted, not as political?
No, just particular.
Okay.
Like that the sort of shared immigrant experience. And this across like all, groups that sort of have found themselves outside of the larger narrative. We all sort of we all tailor and operate under, the expectations, but also the audience that we think we're projecting to. And so I guess it stood out for me when I went back to the Philippines in 2006 or 2007. It was the first time as an adult artist, and then hung out with a lot of Filipino artists there. And it was just, they were like, I think there was a lot of like clashes of like, well, why do you think that? Like it was, at least that was, I'm speaking, maybe on their behalf or making assumptions, but yeah, the peculiar Americanness of, our work, I think. And I think that's really hard to also stress to institutions that are looking to artists of color to represent in certain ways, right? And that in a way, like I see myself, I'm an American artist. Like, of course, I'm a Filipino American artist, but I think first and foremost to always pigeonhole it into a kind of like, well, her work speaks about the Filipino experience. I actually say, no, it doesn't. It actually speaks about the American experience, and especially the American lens on Filipinos. Like, I don't think there's anything authentic about my work at all. Speaking for, for me, I don't make personal work. And I think that's kind of interesting, but people assume it's personal because there are potentially brown bodies in it, so it must be about me. It's like,
wow. Thank you for sharing that, because like I mentioned earlier, like I'm intimidated to make work and then like that's not like a personal work, because I don't want to tell a story incorrectly. But then again, I navigate like so many different spaces as so many different identities. Like I'm a Filipino immigrant, but I'm now Americanized. And I live in Texas, and et cetera, my spiritual beliefs. So, so people do make assumptions like, oh, your art must be about being Filipino. And then what is Filipino? There's been that, we've been, like you mentioned, pigeonholed, like it's a monolith, but like Filipinos are rich. It is a rich, there's like Ilocanos, Visayans, Mindanaoans, and all those other ethnic groups that are erased by the term Filipino. And same with American artists. What is that? Like Texas, New York, Los Angeles, et cetera, et cetera.
Then you also have to think about the indigenous people. Yeah. Yeah.
And class, because Filipinos come to this country for lots of different reasons. And it's not always about like because they need better jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You would see it in a lot of, POC works. Is that like a lot of works are either like on food or stories about their grandma or, about their immigration experience and all that. And I'm also one of them, and I'm not really like reflecting on my life of what it was in the Philippines, but I'm reflecting on now and what it could be and what I am now, that I'm living in this kind of like weird space where I can't even define sometimes, like, is this home or what is home, So, and I know a lot of POC artists relate to that, and that's what they make their work for about. And I'm not saying that there's a right or wrong about what your work should be, and because I even had like an identity crisis, and like, am I an artist, or am I a Filipino artist, or am I an American artist now? But someone told me that, well, you make work, so you're an artist. You're Filipino, so the work that you make is Filipino. So I was like, okay, I guess you can convince me with that, with that reasoning. But with identity, I know that Antonius talks about a lot of identity. You talk about a lot of identity with your work, and you do a lot of portraiture with your wood, with your paper cutting. Could you tell us about that and how you pick your subject matter, who they are?
Well, I create life-size hand-cut paper portraits of queer Salesian Americans.
Salesian. Yes.
And yes, they are intricate, ornamental, heavily rooted within labor and craft. But I think at the same time, I constantly question, like, oh my goodness, how colonized is my imagination? Like, it's like, and I think that's something that I want to like actively challenge and push against. And I think in many ways, that's why I've expanded my practice into like a polydisciplinary one that allows for more play and irreverence, really resisting ideas of what we all should be. And this is really silly. I was thinking how, Stephanie, you call it no longer art, but projects. So what would the noun be? Are we projectors? Like,
we're projecting.
That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah.
I actually love that term.
Yeah, a nature sort of thing. But I think, Antonius, what you mentioned too about this, the question of like, well, if you're worried about, say, like, playing up, some of the like the exoticisms or whatever. I don't know what you meant necessarily by that, but and then to just sort of like fantabulate it, maybe, you know, like so far, so much, just to kind of be not correct. You know, that seems to be like really productive, right? Because like everyone's expectations, whether it's even from our own internal communities, because I think I suffer sometimes for, like, you know, Filipinos look at my work and they're like, well, I don't see, you know, like, how am I supposed to relate to this? Like, if I don't see myself reflected in it, or I don't see a traditional thing or something, you know, like how does this speak to me? And, you know, I've had to kind of get over that a little bit, and just maybe be more accepting of, you know, Matt's, you know, kind of notion too of like the multiplicity within that. So you don't always have to be speaking legibly all the time, all the constituents that you supposedly embody.
It's tiring too. But yeah, you know, I get that as well. Like, people, whenever they see my work that are more abstracted, they're always asking like, well, what does this mean? You know, and you're Filipino, like, how does this, you know, kind of like explain your life and you being here? And I'm like, well, that's my current experience, you know? And like what you said, we don't have to always make it legible. And there, well, the thing is, like, my work does that, and then I have some works that are also like kind of like in your face, but it also takes a little bit of digging deeper. And I know you do a lot of like research work, Stephanie, which I've also encountered by digging through history of American and US colonization. Does that change like your view of how the future will be? Like, knowing the deep and dark history of what the relationship is?
Oh, no, that's a really good question, right? So what Matt's referring to is, like, I've been spending the last year going through the Smithsonian archives in Washington, D.C., like looking for evidence of not just Filipinos and Filipino Americans, but all Asian Americans in however we're supposed to exist within this National Museum of American History. And it was shocking to see how, you know, little we were there, which obviously isn't true. Right. It's not like we weren't there. It's just that the nation's, you know, kind of collections has overlooked or decided that this wasn't, you know, part of the story. So it actually, it's made me more depressed than I thought I would be, because it's so deep rooted. You know, it goes so deep. And part of my interest too is just to see like what America's story of itself is. And it's by and large, like, you know, incredibly exclusionary, as we know. But when you look at the documentation and the evidence, or the lack of evidence, it really, you know, it's a huge task. Like, whatever entities or individuals or groups are going to fill these archives with what actually needs to be there, you know, wow, super. That's our jobs, I guess, or everybody's jobs to a certain extent.
Well, how do you feel, Antonius, with your work also talking about, you know, the Vietnamese and the US relationship? I know that's really heavy, and I know you've also done a lot of research towards that.
Yeah, I love archives.
Me too. Oh my gosh.
To dive into. But yeah, I do an annual dedication of objects in front of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall, and every non-living object actually gets stored away in the National Archive. And upon a visit in 2015, out of the hundreds of thousands of objects left behind and collected, only 6 were recorded to be from Vietnamese refugee communities. And I think, having done 3 dedications now with an entire group of Southeast Asians, we're constantly questioning, like, why are we always responding to the archives that are already here? And like, should we be creating our own spaces, our own archives, being in charge of our own histories and storytellings? And I'm thinking a lot about like the Smithsonian. We don't have a Smithsonian Asian Pacific Islander American building. Yes, we have an organization, but we don't have a physical space in itself. And in many ways, that does lead to, they call these things culture labs. And they're very innovative, they're very community focused, and they allow us to stretch beyond physical space. So I see the beauty and power in that as well. Like almost like the lack of definition allows us to create our own language systems.
Mm-hmm. So these are objects too, right? Oh yeah, you were gonna say, Royal?
Oh no, I was gonna say that reminds me of this documentary that I watched on this native group. They opened their own casino and they wanted to get some of their artifacts back from a museum, but the museum had they had to fly to, I think it was like Washington, where after so many emailing back and forth and pleading to give their artifacts back, and it's like, why? These are adult people with their own autonomy and this is their own artifacts from their ancestors. But it was like the institution just didn't trust them with it. Like, what are they going to do? Just be careless with it. So that just kind of reminds me of what you mentioned about not having, should we have our own stuff? And it's like, why do we have to beg these institutions for our stuff back?
Yeah. We greatly talked about this with the Death to Museums panel that I was part of. And we really got into it. We had Indigenous people who were part of the panel as well, and they were really mad about how the institutions were really holding on to these objects that they would use for their everyday things, but then they are put in this inaccessible spaces that are, like in vitrines or like museums with security and all that. And why, and it kind of reminds me of when we had this conversation, Royal, too, I think it was a while back, and you got a hold of these Mickey Mouse money.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And putting value on these things which don't have value. I thought that was really interesting. Could you talk about that?
So this was also last year, 2020 was just a wild ride.
It was last year?
It was last year. I was looking up, what is it? The death money, the ancestral money that Vietnamese people burn at the altar or whatever. And I was like, I wonder if Filipinos have something like that, So I started searching for it and none of the searches popped up, but I did find, so I just typed in on Etsy, Philippine money. And then this mint collector popped up on my search, and it was a person who collected rare types of money. And I found so back then, when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, they basically canceled the pesos and started giving out their own money, and revolutionaries and rebels created their own printing press to print out Filipino money to hold back Japanese. So if you were caught with that money, you would be killed. And now I have a hold of that. And so it's just so interesting because the money doesn't mean anything. But because of the implications of having it, now it's worth a lot. Yeah.
We put a lot of value into things and objects and spaces. And it kind of makes me think about what's happening right now at the Capitol. How when we were having the Black Lives Matter protests and how the National Guards were out and media was calling them rioters, but now you have videos of the police themselves kind of just letting them in, and then you see one guy looting a podium, and it just makes me think of and like what this country really is about. And I'm not really surprised, I guess, just, my personal opinion, but like just the value of like what our country has, and makes me think also of how like art is also connected to that, and the objects that we put in the museums, and then the objects that are where people are being killed, like a TV from Target or something, and someone gets killed because they got it, but then someone gets a podium from the Capitol and he gets away with it. It's just like, I don't know. It's
it's frustrating. It's very frustrating, and it's like, what do we do? I feel like all hands need to be on deck. But now the media, we have to watch out the type of language that we're listening to in the media. They're now calling these protesters anarchists, but it's like, so it's they not once did they call them fascists, but a lot of they were calling them like anarchists or protesters, but never fascists. So it's a lot of like distraction and language and trying to change the narrative, and is it who is this narrative, like who is it benefiting, who's if the narrative changes, and I see that happening in our motherland, the Philippines. Lots of narrative changes, lots of media lies, and yeah.
Do you feel like 2020 has kind of like prepared us in some way to be ready for 2021 in the events that like things like that happen again, or
Oh man.
or do you think artists, or how we can play like a big role in supporting these initiatives? Do you think 2020 has kind of like prepared us?
I think that artists, like Nina Simone said, that our responsibility is to reflect the times. And, whenever the George Floyd's protests started happening, like we saw a lot of these institutions and companies releasing a statement about like, we need to stand with our Black brothers and sisters, but they weren't very clear on the dialogue. And I like that as Filipinx artists of Houston, we were like, a Black man was murdered by police. Like, this is what we need to do. We stand in solidarity with people, with our Black community, and blah, blah, blah. And so we have to be succinct and not like water down our message, because that easily gets co-opted. So like a lot of these revolutionary messages like abolition has been co-opted by liberals, and it's just like watering it down. That what is really abolition now? Do they want to abolish police, or do they want to improve the police a little bit? So we have to be like really direct with how we want to have our message come across.
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree with you. We actually have a question from Sue Vu, who is an audience. Do you think all your works connect with each other or have something in common with yours? In what ways? I'm guessing she's referring to all of us, our works connecting with each other.
Ooh.
And in what ways?
Oh, okay.
I think maybe one way to think is a sort of like a definition of politics, right? So whether or not, in other words, like the politics could appear and operate differently, right? Like I think each of us actually has a very sort of like, developed direction that we're focusing on with our aesthetics and work. So I think I could claim that all of us see our works in a kind of through a political lens in certain ways. It just looks different, right? So not everything looks like a political protest, or not everything looks like a representation of politics. But because of its existence, it could function politically. I'm sort of just throwing this all on everyone based on, like our quick images that got sent out. But because I guess the reason I raise politics is, again, just maybe because contextually, right? This weird moment, this potential ending of a 4 years, or the beginning or introduction of something even worse. Like we really don't know necessarily. Like I'm not as hopeful, I think, as the majority of folks out there who think that, yay, things are going to be better. But I guess that's where my investment lies, is sort of like how we articulate politics, even when it doesn't necessarily appear political.
I remember seeing this post where it says you have to make the fight, what do you call that? Like irresistible.
Oh yeah. Something about the artist's responsibility is to make revolution irresistible, or something like that. Yeah.
I kind of see it as well. But now that you mentioned, Stephanie, that yours is not really personal, but in a way, I kind of see that we're trying not to be model minorities as well. And, I think it plays for us specifically because we are of like the Asian community, and how being model minorities is like huge. And I know that Antonius talks about that a lot in their work as well. So yeah, I think that's where, for me at least, I think that's where I find like a commonality in our works. But yeah, like what you said, all is different. It's presented in a different way, but we still talk about almost the same things.
Yeah.
Also,
I think
yeah.
I wanted to add, like, as much as we say it doesn't look political, I think we're like always operating under a political umbrella. We're living in a capitalist society. We are all like, our ancestors have experienced like colonization, and our work reflects that. And sometimes it looks pretty, but then like once you start unpacking the story, it's like, okay, like, yeah, you're telling this story about this political issue, but the aesthetics is like nice and cute.
Yeah. We have another question. Craft has always had the power to connect people. While there are craft processes that hold specific values and meaning cross-culturally, there are certain aspects of the use of material and shared techniques that are also universal. Especially in today's environment, craft-related programming provides an opportunity for people to come together outside of normal routines and learn from one another. Based on your experiences, can you reflect on the topic of craft as a catalyst for fostering conversation and building relationships between individuals? Would you like me to repeat the question? It's kind of long.
Yes.
Okay, let me repeat that again. Craft has always had the power to connect people. While there are craft processes that hold specific values and meanings cross-culturally, there are certain aspects of the use of material and shared techniques that are also universal. Especially in today's environment, craft-related programming provides an opportunity for people to come together outside of normal routines and learn from one another. Based on your experiences, can you reflect on the topic of craft as a catalyst for fostering conversation and building relationships between individuals?
Well, I'll throw out there that I think sometimes craft can be a really interesting, and by craft, I mean, in the way that the question was framed, right? So bringing people together and programming, and I'm sort of assuming like workshops and these sorts of like communal spaces where people make things together. And so I guess in a way like that, craft can operate not just as like a skill set, but actually as a Trojan horse, right? It's a method. It's a method of creating a shared space and also knowledge sharing. But I also think that there's sometimes there can be a fetishization of craft where, just because something is really well made or it's intricate or you spent a lot of time on it, it must be better. And so there's this interesting balance, I think. And I think it's ironic for me to say this because I think there's also a devaluation of labor, that happens, especially hand labor in an era in which a lot of things are digital, or digitally manipulated, like my background. And but yeah, no, I guess like what I've noticed actually during this pandemic, and this is interesting to see if you all notice this too, the dialogue around craft of being a kind of like homey, communal, fun, relaxing thing to do in the midst of the chaos out there. I'm like, I don't know. Like I think for certain things, but it's interesting to see craft, these collective spaces sometimes reduced to ameliorative or palliative opposition to actual, contestation, right? Like what's antagonistic craft? Like that's interesting. Right? Like it's sort of the assumption that social practice art always has to be about knitting communities together. There's actually like social practice and antagonism, that there's ways sometimes of like creating frictions. And so I think the healing notion of craft sometimes actually is overutilized to sort of smooth over things. But again, I'm just speaking sort of from my experience as, someone who's been curating a lot of craft shows, where a lot of it is about like kindness and craft, getting together in craft. And I'm like, not without better work, more work.
Wow. I didn't think about it like that. Like what is craft? Like, I don't know if I've ever worked in those spaces before. As a person who makes murals, like the stuff that I do does bring community conversation because, I'm painting on a wall large scale, and that's not something that one sees every day. So people want to ask questions. What am I doing? Who's, what's the story? Is this legal? And so it does bring community, but that's an interesting take for antagonistic craft. Like unless somebody was like painting like Donald Trump on a wall, I feel like that's antagonistic. I don't know.
Yeah, Stephanie, I love what you brought up about the Trojan horse, because I think craft has always been one of the most subversive, queerest fields of studies, subjects, whatever word you want to use to accompany craft. But I think about like the AIDS memorial quote started by gay rights activist Cleve Jones, and how now we have 48,000 panels from 50 states, and its craft is oftentimes one of the greatest vehicles for not only community building, but political mobilization. And I think a lot about like mask making, the sharing of skill on how to make a mask, the deeply problematic but powerful pussy hats. Yeah, very white feminist, but at the same time, it really was a really powerful craft tool in terms of, what's it called? Signaling where you stood, signaling your feminism and your allegiances. And so I think, craft is oftentimes so undervalued, overlooked. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it dares to be more transparent and accessible compared to other fields. And because of that, then it's seen as less serious, which is really, really problematic.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's interesting that there's like this hierarchy of what is considered like high art versus like lowbrow art, and like who makes that decision. Um, is it society? Is it institutions? Is it our like mere opinions? And yeah, that's an interesting take.
Well, it's definitely, institution. um, but we can also change that by, making or giving value to those things, or to craft, and just, I guess, and how we frame it is what is most important, I think, especially if we have that privilege of giving access to these projects. And we have another question. Drawing from your experiences, I'm interested in hearing your perspectives on how arts organizations can better serve their local constituents. Even if good intentions are there, sometimes a program falls short due to logistical challenges, as well as shortfalls in identifying the needs and desires of intended participants. How can organizations play a better supporting role in facilitating work between artists and the public and or specific communities? Are there specific projects or programming in this capacity that you have either worked with or know of that you can point to as being particularly successful?
Sorry. Ooh. I can't tell of a program, but I think just like giving the artist autonomy, and then instead of just like, here is the amount of money that we want to give you, but this is the confines that you have to work in. So it's like y'all mentioned earlier about wanting to distribute funds to artists that y'all want to commission, but then there's this thing that you have to go through with the grants. I guess just trusting that that you chose the artist because of the work that they provide. So you should trust that they're going to make the right decision with the money. That's one thing.
Also a kind of meta issue, that's sort of buried in that question too, about the efficacy of an artist project to sort of, to have lasting impact on a community. And one is that artists are called upon constantly to kind of create palliative, remedial, temporary situations for things that are systemic. And so, in a way that question is almost like a setup, because I mean, it's a good question, and it's a deserving question, but it also, I think, puts pressure on the artist to somehow work with an institution to solve things that actually are beyond the capabilities. And again, I'm not trying to dodge the question, but one thing that institutions have a tendency to do is create programming that does that. And programming is temporary. And of course it can build and create intersections in communities and have, impact, ripple effect impact. But it's different from, say, investing in structural changes within an organization. So Matt, back to actually circling to one of the very first questions you asked in the beginning, which is like, what can institutions do? I mean, I think I've heard a lot of people, also expound on this, where it's not just adding more artists of color to the rosters, and it's not just having more exhibitions of artists of color, but it's fundamentally changing the staffing, the curatorial, and the internal organization structures. But whether or not, the pace of that is slow. And, I see that also as a university professor. It's like you have folks that aren't gonna, that are staying for a very long time. And so we've got this lag. And I guess the question also for us is like, are we willing to set up parallel institutions in the meantime, as the brick and mortar institutions are also tasked with moving slowly?
Yeah.
Amen to all of that, Royal and Stephanie. And I think on top of that, touching upon like community building, like, is your community in the room? Are they involved in the meetings? Are they on your board, your staff, your audience? Check thyself, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Before
also,
you wreck yourself.
what do we mean by community also? You know, like, who are we really talking about? Is that a euphemism for like Black people? Is that a euphemism for brown people? You know, like, what do we mean by that? When people task us with like, we'd like you to do a project about your community. You know, it's like, oh, you're outsourcing the jobs to us. I guess, I mean, someone's got to do it. I'm just speaking really off the cuff here, but you know, not to harp on that question, but it is a good question because it deserves asking.
Yeah.
We
haven't. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Community. Yes, exactly. And I also want to add, like, is it whenever we say community, is our community that we belong in, are they all privileged and do they all have the same accesses? So I'm thinking about access, and we're talking about, like, you know, community organizing. It's like, who is in the community? Are there vulnerable people in the community? Are there people that are on the fringes of society that is considered community? Or is it just people who think like us or talk like us or look like us?
Mm-hmm. Inclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. Yeah. Well, okay, let's go on to the next question too. It's from Jenna. Have the narratives the artists wanted to tell changed throughout 2020 in comparison to what they've done in previous?
That's a great question. Shout out to Jenna. I think that the narratives of 2020 has like radically changed how I want to make art now. Currently, I have an exhibition that I'm working on, and it's like the very first that I've ever done an installation. And it's telling my story because I'm seeing so many parallels. And I was talking to the folk called Boomerang with my org earlier today about how there's parallels that are happening in the Philippines and it's happening here because, you know, imperialists experimented on our people before, you know, refining it and then taking it to the streets here in the United States. And so I want to like reflect more of that. And because I'm seeing that, it's like I want to tell my story with my immigrant experiences because I wouldn't be here without US-backed dictator Ferdinand Marcos. So that's happening.
Antonius?
I'm really trying to hold on to the slowness that I think all of us need. And so I'm gonna continue to try to resist the pace that 2021 is already demanding.
That's lovely. I want to do that so badly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think 2020 has been like our year to expand our definitions of art, beauty, and success. And yeah, I think many institutions need more time to just really reflect on what that means. And I'm just gonna slow down whenever I can.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips on how to slow down?
Let's see. I'm working on that.
Because I know I need it.
Okay. Definitely waking up earlier and making time for myself has been good. Yeah, so I try to wake up like at a crack of dawn and be by myself.
I did the opposite. Like now I wake up late, but like prior to the pandemic, I was like on it, waking up at like 4 a.m. and getting my exercise in. But now it's just like, the world is a dumpster fire right now. What's waking up like a few hours later? But I do want to get back to that because waking up early did really set the tone for me. And you're right, like it's been so demanding. I feel like we're going through this pandemic like a portal, and then people are trying to like speed up this portal and go back to normalcy, while our brains are still, and our bodies and souls are still in this like slow down process. It's tough.
I think for me, my focus is, I just realized, so to try to create more or to focus more work on projects that create more resources. And so, and again, the word resources, it's so vague, right? It's like community resources, but things that could become like platforms or entry points for others to gain access, to knowledge or to things. And so not sure yet what exactly that's going to look like, but it just, again, being in institutions the way we are, and then also having to kind of create the parallel ones, I think that's been, for me, the big wake up call of 2020, of just like, they're not going to do it for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, we're not going to be saved by anybody.
That's actually what 2020 has done to me. is that realization. For our last question, are you all ready?
Oh wow, it's already over. It's the end already.
I know, but this is also good. That means our viewers are still paying attention to us. Okay, so Nikolai asks if each artist can share what they're working on now.
Oh, I guess I'll
Matt,
begin.
you have to answer too.
Oh yeah, Matt, you answer first.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm actually working or catching up on some commission work, which is kind of like my day job in a way. So I make paintings, like whatever they want. But also really making ideas kind of simmer up, like just like what Antonius was saying about slowing down, and prepping for shows. Like what Steven said earlier, I'm part of a group show with the Blaffer opening this month, so I'm prepping for that, and then and also working for A-Leaf Art House things, getting ready to showcase the work, and bring in a new artist for next month. And I'm very grateful for Antonius for working with me with that, and also for always being supportive with the initiative. So yeah, that's what I'm currently working on.
Nice. So I am working on the Artist on Site exhibition running until January 24th at Asia Society. It's a lot, like I mentioned earlier, it's basically an exhibit about, it's an altar on my immigrant experiences. So yeah, go check me out. I'm also focusing on like growing my edible garden. And so last year I kept saying, oh, I didn't make that much art, and people had to keep reminding me, like, you did so much work in your garden, like, and you're growing food. That's not something to be ignored, and it's art. And so again, the definition of what art is, like, do you have to produce tangible work that people can buy for something to be considered art, or can you just make it in your backyard? You know what I mean? If nobody sees it, is it still art? So that's something I'm unpacking.
Project.
I have the honor of working with Matt on A-Leaf Art House for a bit, so that's wonderful. And I've been thinking a lot about the co-optation of self-care and wellness. So I'm actually creating guided meditations and commissioning other artists as well, as a way to imagine future, work towards emergent strategies, and make subversive meditations.
Yes.
Wow.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still processing thousands of photographs and images that I've harvested from the Smithsonian archives. And so I'm trying to create a bunch of exhibitions and projects, but also make some leaps of logic with it, like kind of take liberties with what some of these things are. And then also create a couple, I guess I think of them as like databases. Like I have some fake institutions or like fake study centers that I work on, and they're like collections of documents and things that are sort of like a counter narrative to certain stories. But yeah, it's all political, right? Projects.
Yeah. Projects, yes. I think I'm going to start using that word as well. And I'm not going to be an artist anymore. I'm going to be a projector, like what Antonius said.
Well, it puts everything on an equal platform, right? Like Royal, you have the project out in your backyard, and then you have your project, in the mural world, and then in the gallery. It's great.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but if we called everything art, then we can be like, everything is art. I'm making art right now, and I'm just making dinner. You know what I mean? So that's like magical too.
It adds the sparkles to something.
Yeah.
Well, it has been a wonderful evening. And I'm very honored to be in the presence of Antonius, Royal, and Stephanie. Thank you so much for your time. We will be hearing from Stephen.
Hey everyone. I just want to sort of do a little wrap up and just offer some thank yous. First of all, a huge thank you to Matt for being such a skillful, inclusive, and generous moderator. Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you to all. Thanks to all of the artists for really your honesty, your candor, your insight, and for just sharing a real unvarnished conversation with us. It was truly an honor to just listen in and to hear all of your opinions and perspectives on all of the things that we've discussed. I want to give another thanks to the amazing tech team at Asia Society for overseeing all of this and for allowing it to run so smoothly. And a big thanks to Bridget Bray for all of her coordination. And of course, to Catherine and Perry at the Center for Contemporary Craft. It's been such a pleasure to work with all of the organizations. And a thank you to the audience. Thank you for joining us. Please, the Asia Society's shared website, the artists' websites and their Instagram, please dive deep into their websites, follow them on Instagram, and please come out and see Stephanie's exhibition. Unvarnished plug for the Blaffer Museum. Stephanie's exhibition is up until January 10th. And we have installations at the Anderson Library, at the Architecture College, and Public Address, a nationwide virtual protest, which is showing at the UH Student Center, but you can also visit it online. There's a YouTube channel, there's a website, and you can be a participant. So thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us on this evening. Thank you to our artists, our panelists, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone. Great conversation.